Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute most famous manhunts in modern history, just to see how the US military actually cracked the case. We're going to break down the incredible and honestly almost unbelievable chain of events that finally led to the capture of Saddam Hussein.
So, set the scene in your mind for a second. It's 2003. Picture a tiny, rural Iraqi village in the dead of night. You've got hundreds of US soldiers sweeping through the town, and as they reach this totally unassuming farmhouse, a soldier unearths a piece of rope buried in the dirt. And that rope, it leads straight down to a hidden trap door, which is bizarrely, almost comically, concealed with nothing more than a piece of styrofoam.
The tension in that exact moment must have been absolutely off the charts. The soldiers pry open the door and literally get ready to drop a grenade into the dark hole, just to be safe. But right before the pin is pulled, everybody freezes. A pair of hands emerges from the darkness, followed by a heavily bearded man. He throws his hands up, surrenders to the soldiers above, and states clearly, "My name is Saddam Hussein. I'm the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate." Now, we all know how this story ends, right? That image of the infamous spider hole is completely burned into modern pop culture. But what's really fascinating is how they actually got to that specific hole in the ground. What was the incredibly unlikely chain of clues that guided investigators to that exact farm? Because it wasn't just brute force, it was a bizarre, giant puzzle.
Think about the timeline here. The initial military operation was lightning fast. Baghdad fell in a mere 3 weeks. But tracking down Saddam himself, well, that took agonizing months of dead ends, dragging the hunt all the way out to December. To help soldiers actually recognize high-value targets during those frustrating months, the military came up with a pretty clever visual aid. They issued a special deck of playing cards for the troops on the ground. Soldiers are always playing cards during downtime, so this literally put the faces of the 52 most wanted officials right in their hands. And as you might expect, Saddam Hussein was the ultimate ace of spades, right above his two sons, Uday and Qusay.
But as months dragged on without any solid leads, the military decided they needed to up the ante. So they placed a staggering $25 million bounty directly on Saddam's head, plus another $15 million for each of his sons. The idea was that this massive pile of cash would be the exact incentive needed to shake loose some actionable info from the public.
And, initially, it totally seemed like the money worked. About 4 months into the war, an informant walks onto a base and tips off troops to a mansion up in Mosul. U.S. forces surround the place, a massive firefight breaks out, and it actually takes a missile strike to end it, resulting in the deaths of Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay. And the U.S. made a huge point to publicly pay out that combined $30 million reward to the informant, even relocating them to the States.
The logic there was pretty straightforward. Heavily publicize this massive payout, and you'll trigger a flood of new, reliable leads, right? Show them you're serious about the cash. But unfortunately, it totally backfired. Instead of finding Saddam, they just hit a frustrating string of false alarms, sending violent task force raids into completely empty safe houses. The trail was going ice cold.
And this right here is where the entire investigation pivots. It's a real game changer. A staff sergeant named Eric Maddox realized they were kind of looking at this all wrong. The old strategy was all about that deck of cards, hunting down former politicians whose power came from Saddam. But Maddox realized Saddam didn't need politicians right now. He needed protection. They needed to stop hunting the suits and start hunting the elite bodyguards. See, Saddam's security was layered. You had the outermost guys guarding fixed sites and travel routes, but Maddox bypassed all that. He focused entirely on the innermost circle, a group known as the Hamaya. This was the most elite tier of Saddam's detail. Maddox zeroed in on a specific family network that staffed this tier, all based right out of Saddam's heavily searched hometown of Tikrit. This laser focus on the Hamaya brought one specific name bubbling to the surface, Mohammed Abraham. Now, this guy wasn't just a trusted inner circle bodyguard. Maddox discovered he was actually out there coordinating funds and running the ongoing resistance against the U.S. occupation. If anybody alive knew exactly where Saddam was hiding, it was Mohammed Abraham. He instantly became the ultimate target. But catching him, man, it was like pulling teeth. Maddox couldn't just look him up. He had to follow this incredibly fragile breadcrumb trail. First, they interrogate Mohammed's nephew, which leads them to two business associates, which exposes the identity of a driver, which finally leads investigators to Mohammed Ibrahim's own son. So here is where it gets wild. During the interrogation, the son admits he doesn't know where his dad is, but he casually drops this seemingly useless detail. His father still fishes at a local pond he owns in Samara. Hearing that triggered a massive realization for Maddox. He suddenly remembered a past interrogation with Saddam's former housekeeper, who mentioned that Saddam absolutely loved eating muskuf, a very specific Iraqi fish. You literally can't make this up. The world's most wanted man was essentially tracked down because of his appetite for a specific fish dish.
Suddenly, the trail is red hot. That tiny culinary clue leads forces to raid the fish farm in Samara. Muhammad isn't there, but two fishermen are. One of them casually mentions an uncle who has a house down in Baghdad. So, out of better options, troops raid that Baghdad apartment, an area completely controlled by the U.S. coalition, mind you, and against all odds, they find Muhammad Ibrahim hiding right there in plain sight. It was just this bizarre series of incredibly weak links that finally cracked the case.
So Maddox interrogates the captured bodyguard, promises protection for him and his family, and Muhammad breaks. He agrees to lead U.S. troops right to Saddam. Which brings us full circle, right back to our opening scene. Muhammad guides them to the small farming village of Ad-Dawr, pointing out two unassuming farmhouses near the Tigris River. But as troops frantically tear the buildings apart, they find absolutely nothing. The soldiers are getting frustrated, ready to pack it up and call it another dead end. But Muhammad Ibrahim knows exactly where Saddam is. He just sort of suffers this final mental block. He was willing to help, but he just couldn't bring himself to verbally betray his former boss out loud. So standing outside a small shack, he just casually kicks at a half-buried piece of rope in the dirt. It is absolutely wild to think that a massive, high-tech, multi-million-dollar military operation finally came down to a guy kicking a rope in the dirt. That kick directed the confused soldiers to pull the rope, reveal the trapdoor, and finally uncover the ace of spades. American official Paul Bremer soon stepped up to a podium and delivered that iconic announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. It marked the end of a totally grueling manhunt. But you know, the story of how that moment was presented to the rest of the world is just as crucial to understanding this whole era.
Almost immediately after the capture, the U.S. military went on this massive public relations offensive. They deliberately paraded international journalists through that miserable, dirty little spider hole. And even further, they publicly released deeply humiliating footage of a disheveled Saddam undergoing a basic medical and dental exam. They really wanted to broadcast his absolute vulnerability to the entire world.
See, both sides in this conflict fully understood that imagery is a wildly potent weapon of war. For decades, Saddam had saturated state media to build this larger-than-life, untouchable cult of personality. The U.S. counter-narrative needed to aggressively dismantle that intimidating propaganda. With global support for the war starting to wane, the military intentionally used these pathetic images of a defeated man in a hole to just totally erode the myth of Saddam Hussein. Which brings us to a final, kind of provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. The invasion began with claims of weapons of mass destruction, claims that, as we know, proved false. So it leaves us to wonder, was the highly staged presentation of Saddam's downfall carefully designed to rewrite the visual memory of an invasion whose initial justifications were falling apart? It's a powerful reminder that in war, the battle for the narrative is often just as important as the battle on the ground. Thanks for joining me.